The day I was confronted by my ex-husband's new wife at my daughter's birthday was like something out of a nightmare. My stomach churns just thinking about it. The worst part? I had just exposed his twisted intentions to exploit our daughter's future wealth. It all started when I was 27 and pregnant with my daughter, living a life I thought I could endure with Boris, my ex-husband. At first, Boris seemed like the guy I could fix. At 33, he had been working as a cashier at Target, making barely enough to survive. I didn't care about his low-paying job. When we started talking, I felt this magnetic connection, like we were meant to be. I even agreed to a second date, feeling a sense of potential between us that I couldn't explain. In the beginning, Boris only paid for his share of meals, and it was fine, maybe even endearing. It was early, and I didn't mind. But as we became more comfortable, he started sharing more about his past. He spoke of a childhood where his father disappeared, leaving him and his mother to fend for themselves. I could see the pain in his eyes, and my heart went out to him. I wanted to believe in him, to help him find a way out of that rough history. He told me his dream was to become a freelance artist. I believed in it. I wanted to support him, so when we were 2 months in, we were already in deep. He wanted to move in together, convinced that we were meant to take this plunge. I knew it was fast, but I loved him and thought it would work. It felt right. Once we lived together, Boris quit his job. He said he needed to focus on finding freelance work to pursue his dreams. Meanwhile, I worked full-time, picking up the slack with rent and bills. I was the only one contributing to the household, while he told me he was looking for opportunities. Sure, he found a few jobs, but none lasted. His clients weren't satisfied, and he never seemed to learn from his mistakes. All the while, I watched him waste more and more time playing video games on the couch. Meanwhile, I was running on empty, working hard all day just to come home to a dirty house. I'd ask him to clean, but he'd always have an excuse. He'd say he was tired after applying for jobs and that I needed to be more understanding. I'd send him job listings, but he'd mock me, claiming the work was either too far or didn't pay enough. He'd tell me how easy my life was, how I could never understand his struggles. It was maddening. He was doing nothing while I did everything. His mother, Hillary, wasn't much help. I had met her a few times, and it was clear she didn't like me. She'd lecture me about not pushing her son too hard to get a job, as if I was the problem. She'd tell me I should be grateful that he was trying his best. But I was supporting him financially, and that didn't sit right with me. When I pointed out that maybe she should help pay the bills, it sent them both into a rage. She'd tell me how ashamed I should be to ask for more money when she was a single parent, but she didn't seem to grasp that her grown son wasn't contributing at all. It made no sense to me. Then, things between Boris and I started to unravel even more. His behavior became cruel. He called me names, and would often mention other women, or even threaten to leave me over trivial things. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was working full-time, contributing to everything. Yet he criticized me for not fulfilling the traditional gender roles he expected, like cooking and cleaning. It didn't matter that I was working my fingers to the bone, keeping everything afloat. I was criticized for not meeting his standards. The worst part was how he started to drain our savings account. The money that was supposed to support us was going toward useless purchases, things we didn't need. When I tried to talk to him about saving money, he accused me of controlling him. Meanwhile, I was the one keeping us from falling apart. And when I pushed him to get a job, he'd do nothing about it. He just threw more excuses at me, like I was nagging him. It was overwhelming. I couldn't breathe under the weight of it all. By this point, my family had seen enough. They knew what he was, and they urged me to leave him. My sister, ever the planner, suggested I move in with her for a while to regroup and start saving money. I didn't want to, because part of me still loved him. But slowly, I began to realize this relationship wasn't what I wanted anymore. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found out I was pregnant. The shock of it hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't tell Boris immediately because I knew his reaction would be explosive. This wasn't planned, and I was torn about what to do. But everything changed when I heard my baby's heartbeat for the first time. I knew, in that moment, that I would keep the baby. I would give my daughter everything she deserved. When I finally told Boris, he was furious. He shouted at me, claiming that a baby would ruin our lives. He said it wasn't the right time. I told him he was free to leave. I was perfectly capable of raising this child on my own. But then, of course, he called his mother to complain. He accused me of using him for his sperm, and his mother joined in, attacking me for getting pregnant without being married. Their words cut through me, but I refused to let them win. I locked myself in the bedroom and called my parents. The news was bittersweet for them. They were happy about their first grandchild, but devastated that the father was Boris. My sister, who never wanted children, didn't understand. Everyone was buzzing with excitement about my daughter's arrival. My parents called and said they'd be coming over the next day to talk and help me make a decision. When they met with Boris the following day, my dad didn't hold back. He looked Boris in the eye and told him, flatly, that we didn't need him in our lives. He insisted that I move in with them so they could take care of me while Boris could continue living in the house and pay the rent. The look on Boris's face was priceless. His eyes widened in shock, and he immediately protested. "This is my child as much as yours," he said, almost pleading. "It's my duty as the father to provide." Then, in an attempt to salvage the situation, he told my parents that he had been thinking things over since the night before and was finally ready to step up and be a good partner. I was stunned. This was the first time I'd heard him speak like this. But there was something in his eyes, some steely determination, that made me waver. I wanted to believe him. I wanted things to work out. If only he had been a real partner all along, if he had supported me, if he had been a man who carried his weight, I never would have even thought of leaving. But, as my parents watched, I faltered. I agreed to stay, but only if he promised to get a job and contribute. My parents were not convinced, though. They made it clear that they were going to keep a very close eye on the situation. Not long after that, to his credit, Boris found a job. But his attitude didn't change. He would complain endlessly about how unhappy he was to be working again, and would always be in a terrible mood when he came home. But still, I tried to stay hopeful. At least, he was doing something. That's when I began to notice the pattern. His family members were constantly reaching out to him for help, and I don't mean emotional support. I mean money. It was always his mother calling with another sob story. Her kitchen sink broke, or the refrigerator was too old. And his cousins, they'd ask him for money to cover late car payments or repairs. It was relentless, and every time without fail, Boris would say yes. And you know what that meant for me? It meant I was picking up the slack. I was covering rent, bills, everything. And the worst part was how his family expected gifts, expensive ones, at every occasion. They'd get upset if they didn't get what they wanted. It was maddening. Finally, I had enough. After one particularly irritating request from his mom for money to fix her refrigerator, I decided to draw a line in the sand. I refused to cover for Boris anymore, especially when it came to his monthly car payment. I had to teach him a lesson. It was exhausting, but eventually, he learned. He stopped lending money to everyone except his mother, who still managed to squeeze something out of him every now and then. Once we managed to save a little, we made the decision to get married before the baby arrived. We couldn't afford anything extravagant. There was no money for that. But we had a small wedding at our local church. My dad covered the costs. The ceremony itself, though, was nothing short of a disaster. Boris's mother, Hillary, spent the entire time complaining. The venue was too small. My dress was too modern. Everything about it was wrong in her eyes. She couldn't hold her tongue about how unhappy she was that I was pregnant before marriage. Her voice carried, and soon enough, some of my family overheard her. They immediately jumped to my defense, telling her she should be blaming her son, not me. The tension escalated quickly. My dad, visibly angry, told Hillary to leave. Boris tried to interject, but my dad was firm. He insisted she go. She left, red-faced, humiliated. But deep down, I knew she wouldn't just let it go. Sure enough, a few days later, I got a long message from her accusing me of trying to take her son away and claiming I was going to be the worst mother. I showed it to Boris, hoping for some support, but instead, he shrugged it off. He told me I shouldn't have let my dad kick her out, that what we did was wrong anyway. Of course, we fought about it, but I didn't want our marriage to start off with that kind of argument, so I let it slide. Despite all this, Hillary didn't stop harassing me. I learned to ignore her as best I could, but the whole ordeal was wearing me down. The final stretch of my pregnancy was hectic, and I could feel the tension rising. But Boris didn't lift a finger to help. He'd started coming home later and later. The day I went into labor, I called him repeatedly, but he never picked up. I was on my own, panicking, so I called my parents. They rushed to my side. My mom stayed with me in the delivery room while my dad waited outside. Throughout the day, my dad tried contacting Boris, but he was nowhere to be found. Hours later, he showed up at the hospital, giving me the excuse that he had been too busy to check his phone. I was fuming. I couldn't hold back. I screamed at him. I told him that I had informed him about the due date before he left for work. He had known, yet he ignored my calls. Boris's response was infuriating. He told me I didn't need him because I was the mother and that my parents were there for me. He accused me of being overdramatic, even saying that this was exactly why he didn't want a child with me. That's when I snapped. His words about our daughter cut through me like a knife. I wanted to leap out of the bed and slap him across the face. Instead, I yelled at him to leave. I couldn't look at him anymore. He left, but my parents rushed in, alarmed by the noise. My dad walked out with Boris, likely to have a serious talk. My mom stayed with me, trying to calm me down. When I was finally discharged, my dad told me he couldn't let me move back in with Boris. He would never be able to take care of me or the baby. Instead, he wanted me to stay with them for a few days, so I agreed. I handed him my house keys to pick up my things. That's when he found Boris sitting in the living room in his pajamas, playing video games. My dad confronted him. "Did you take the day off?" he asked. Boris finally cracked. He admitted that he had been fired 3 months ago and had spent his days drinking and playing games at his cousin's house. When my dad pressed him about looking for another job, Boris shrugged it off, claiming we had enough savings. I lost it when I heard this. The savings weren't just his, they were mine too, and they were meant for our future. But Boris wasn't thinking about that. He was back to his old ways, taking advantage of me. My dad packed all my things, and that was it. I was done. I didn't want to believe it, but I was. My parents were firm. They told me it was time to get a divorce. They emphasized that my and Emma's well-being, both emotionally and financially, were far more important than staying with a man who had shown nothing but irresponsibility and disrespect. As much as I had loved him, I had to admit it. I had married a leech, a man who would drag me down with him if I stayed. I couldn't let that happen. I had to take control of my life. With my parents' support, I contacted a divorce lawyer to explore my options. The more I learned, the clearer it became. I had no idea just how deeply Boris had tangled me in his financial chaos. When I looked at the bills, the credit card debts, and the little savings left, it was clear how much he had left me stranded. The only silver lining was that, despite my parents being well settled, I had nothing to my name. That meant he couldn't take anything from me. I was done, emotionally drained, and just wanted him out of my life. Alimony? I didn't care about it. I would have let him go without asking for child support, but my lawyer insisted that as a father, he had a responsibility. I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. When I served him the divorce papers, his reaction was nothing short of shocking. He pleaded with me, begging me to reconsider, to stay by his side. He kept saying that marriage was about being there for each other, especially in hard times. But I had already checked out. I told him to sign the papers, or else I would force him to pay alimony, something I knew he could never afford. Hillary, of course, didn't stay silent. She sent me message after message, accusing me of using her son, of abandoning him. Her parting words were cruel. She promised he would marry someone more beautiful and wealthier than me. I couldn't help but laugh at her petty insults. I didn't even bother responding, just blocked her, and moved on. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth. As expected, Boris was ordered to pay child support every month, and I was granted full custody. He didn't even contest it. Once it was over, I felt lighter than I had in years, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. It was hard, being freshly divorced with a newborn to care for, but with my parents by my side, I slowly began to rebuild. It's been 4 years now since our divorce. Emma has grown into a sweet, lively girl. As for Boris, he would send a few apologies here and there and try to stay in touch for Emma's sake, wishing her happy birthdays and asking for pictures. He missed her, or so he said. I tried to stay civil for Emma's sake. I didn't want her to grow up resenting her father, but I wasn't about to let him back into my life. Then came Dax. He entered my life a year ago, and he has been everything Boris never was. Dependable, caring, and true to his word. We connected over pottery, a passion we both shared. I hadn't let him too close to Emma yet, still cautious, but I could see a future with him. Boris, on the other hand, was a distant memory, someone I could barely recognize anymore. 3 months ago, I heard through the grapevine that Boris had gotten engaged. It surprised me, but I was happy for him. He'd found someone, I thought. A month later, an invitation to his wedding showed up in my mail. It was from him and his new fiancée. He had asked me, my parents, and Emma to come. I hesitated but agreed. After all, it could be a step forward for Emma to see her father moving on. The wedding went off without a hitch. His bride, though much younger than him, looked happy and radiant. I was struck by how different she seemed from him, full of life, glowing with a joy that he'd never managed to give me. But something about the event felt off. While everyone from his side of the family was there, her side was curiously absent. No parents, no siblings, no friends to share in her big day. Later, during the reception, Boris came over to our table with his new wife, introducing her and inviting Emma to visit them. She was sweet, welcoming, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd be good for Emma. But that moment quickly shattered. I needed to use the restroom, so I wandered off. Just as I turned a corner, I overheard a conversation that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was Boris, talking with his mother-in-law, Hillary. I hadn't seen her in ages, and honestly, I didn't want to. But curiosity pulled me in. I approached them, trying to put the past behind me. That's when I heard it. Boris was admitting that he had married his new wife for her money. He talked about how he couldn't believe she had married him so quickly, and that now, with her wealth, he could live his life without worrying about money. His mother-in-law was encouraging him to secure the house, and he was nodding along, agreeing with her plan. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This was what he had always done: used people, exploited their resources. His words confirmed everything I'd feared. I cleared my throat, not wanting them to think I was eavesdropping. They turned around, shock registering on their faces. Boris, realizing it was just me and not his bride who had overheard, relaxed, but I couldn't let it go. I had to confront him. I asked him straight out if he had really married her for her money. Boris and Hillary gave each other a guilty glance. Boris dismissed me, telling me it was none of my business. Hillary smirked, mocking me, claiming I was just jealous that Boris was going to be richer than me. I shook my head in disbelief, unable to process what I was hearing. Boris, without any shame, admitted that he loved his new wife, but he loved what she could provide him even more. This wasn't just about love, it was about what he could gain. I was stunned. How could he be so brazen? I told him that what he was doing was vile. I had hoped he had changed, but here he was, doing the same thing all over again. Boris didn't care. He didn't care about me, or Emma, or anyone but himself. I turned and walked back to my table, my parents looking at me, concerned. We didn't stay much longer. I told them everything, and, in the end, we left. I didn't want to be around him or his wife any longer. A few months later, Emma's birthday rolled around. I planned a small party for her, invited family and friends, except for Boris. I didn't want him there after everything that had happened. But then, he showed up, with his new wife. I was furious, but I didn't want to make a scene, especially for Emma. She was thrilled to see her dad. He gave her a present and seemed to be enjoying himself. His new wife smiled and wished Emma a happy birthday. Despite everything, I tried to stay calm. Emma deserved to be happy. Later, in the kitchen, my mom and I were preparing food when his new wife walked in, asking if she could help. Something about her seemed off, but I didn't trust myself to make any judgments yet. Little did I know, this moment was just the beginning of more revelations to come. She was such a sweet and genuine girl, helping us set the table, assisting with every little thing throughout the evening. But there was a strange weight on my chest whenever we interacted, as if I couldn't escape the creeping thoughts of Boris's words. His plan, the one he had so casually confessed to me, kept swirling in my mind. A moment of weakness overcame me, and as I was alone with her, I decided to share what I had heard. I thought she might be grateful, or at the very least, concerned. Instead, she exploded with anger. In an instant, her voice rose, loud and harsh. She accused me of being jealous, of trying to ruin her happiness with Boris. The room fell silent. Every conversation stopped. All eyes were on us. She screamed, asking if I truly couldn't see Boris happy after everything I had supposedly put him through. Her words hit me like a slap. I was confused, lost in the frenzy of her accusations. She didn't give me a chance to explain. Boris rushed to her side, comforting her, throwing furious glances at me. He was angry, not with himself, but with me for revealing his true intentions. My parents tried to intervene, tried to explain, but this only made Na more upset. She yelled even louder. Boris, face flushed with anger, announced that they were leaving. He claimed I was making his new wife uncomfortable, and with that, they walked out, leaving me standing there, humiliated. In the eyes of everyone, I was the crazy ex-wife trying to tear apart his new marriage. I felt a pang of embarrassment, but a quiet part of me knew I had done the right thing. At least now my conscience was clear. Unfortunately, people still blamed me for ruining Emma's birthday, and I felt the weight of their judgment. But my parents reassured me, reminding me that exposing the truth was the right choice. We hoped that, in time, Na would see Boris for what he really was. 2 weeks later, I was alone at home when there was a knock at the door. Emma was at school, my parents were out, and the house felt eerily quiet. I opened the door, and there she was, Na, trembling, eyes swollen from crying. She was a wreck. Her body shook as she muttered through her sobs, repeating over and over that she was ruined. I pulled her inside, urging her to sit on the couch while I fetched her some water, trying to calm her down. It took some time before she could speak, but when she did, her voice was laced with regret and horror. She told me I had been right all along. Boris had drained their joint account. She had never noticed, but after our conversation, she had checked. He'd been taking money from her for months. Worse still, he'd made sure his name was on the house deed, giving him 50% ownership. When she confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. He told her that there was nothing she could do now, that she had willingly put his name on everything. She cried harder, calling herself a fool. She felt like she had been blind to his manipulation. She wanted to take him to court to make sure he didn't get away with this, and she begged me to help. She told me how Boris had painted me as the villain during their relationship, calling me a gold digger. That's why she had accused me that night at the party. But now, she was starting to see the truth. She said she needed to sue him and teach him a lesson. I listened, but deep down, I hesitated. The thought of returning to court, facing Boris again, was daunting. The years of our divorce had left me scarred, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to go through that kind of battle once more. But then I thought of Emma. What kind of example would I be setting for her if I just let this slide? I couldn't let Boris continue to ruin people's lives. So, after much thought, I finally agreed to help. I didn't expect what happened next. When I posted about it, I never imagined the flood of comments I would receive. So many people called me the villain for not helping Na sooner. But what they didn't understand was that I had Emma to think about. I couldn't risk her happiness or stability, not after all she had been through. She had been reconnecting with her father, and I didn't want to ruin that. But I realized they were right. I had to step up. I couldn't let Boris continue. So I reached out to Na. I told her I would help. She and her family had hired a top lawyer, and they were going after Boris for everything. The case would be difficult, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I agreed to meet with her lawyers, testify against him, and tell the truth about what I knew. Walking into that courtroom again felt like stepping back into a nightmare, but I pushed through it. I needed to set a good example for Emma. And in the end, Boris lost the case. He had to return every cent he had stolen from Na. She saved her house and didn't have to pay him a single penny in alimony. Through all of this, Na and I became close. She apologized to me many times, and while I hadn't forgotten her past actions, I was able to forgive her. In the end, it was her strength that led to Boris's public humiliation. His lies were exposed for everyone to see, and he was shunned by those around him. I hoped his mother, Hillary, would finally realize the kind of man she had raised. Months passed, and I wanted to share some good news. Life was moving forward. Dax, the man I had been seeing for the past year, asked me to move in with him. I was hesitant at first, worried about Emma's feelings, but to my surprise, she adored him. He was wonderful with her, and my parents helped us make the move. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly happy. Dax was everything Boris wasn't: supportive, reliable, and kind. He loved Emma like his own, and seeing them together warmed my heart. As for Boris, I wanted nothing to do with him anymore. After everything that had come to light about his true nature, I couldn't bear the thought of keeping any connection with him. I spoke to Emma about her father, but I kept it simple. She didn't need the details, just enough for her to understand that we were moving forward. I'm grateful for the community's support and advice. It has helped me navigate some of the toughest moments of my life. And now, as I focus on my future with Dax and Emma, I know that I am finally on the right path.